Ooh.
Whoa.
Got in the way.
How dare you? I'm trapped.
Okay everyone, we're going to get started. My name's Bibi, I'm your chair for this round. I use she/her pronouns and I have a panelist or trainee.
Hi, I'm Natalie, I'm a trainee and my pronouns are she, her.
Awesome, if you please wouldn't mind introducing yourselves, starting from affirmative.
Calvin, first affirmative, he, him.
Carol, second affirmative, she, her.
April, third affirmative, she, her.
Awesome, and then negative.
Bibi, first neg, she, her.
Alessandro, second neg, he, him, please.
Abrar, third neg, he, him.
Gorgeous. Unless anyone has any objections, let's get started. So first affirmative when you're ready.
Anytime?
Yeah, anytime.
Anytime. Can I do it tomorrow?
No, anytime imminently.
Shucks. Okay. Do we really want a world that lets other companies, like oil companies, fossil fuel companies, mining companies, do we really want to have a world where we let them get away with having increasing amounts of carbon emissions and increasing amounts of harm to the environment? That is not a world we as the affirmative team want, and that is a world that the negative team really wants to bolster here. Now, before I get into some of my substantive, I want to just quickly do some framing, do some setup, and then I'm going to go into why I want 2 points of substantive there. So real quick, I want to quickly define what a carbon credit is. So it's just a carbon credit is just a way, as provided by the ACCC or whatever it is, a way for as an incentive, for companies to either or organizations to reduce to reduce their carbon emissions, either via like tax benefits almost, or like just general kind of a showy thing, like a showy thing. So it's supposed to be a tax incentive, and and the main mission and main goal of it is to incentivize companies to be more proactive in reducing their carbon emissions, also to actually hold them accountable. Now, and we also want to quickly focus on defining the companies. So that we generally think they're like, in this debate, two big types of companies or organizations like in this debate. One is the companies who want to save the bottom line and keep practicing doing the not wanting to change in the reduction of carbon emissions because it's cheaper generally, because it's better to the bottom line, because renewable energy is expensive and alternative practices are expensive because of how risky and new they are. And then the other company is the ones who actually do want to change because of the focus, because that's a big part of their brand, that's a big part of the how they operate, and it's just a big part of them, who they are, and it's usually more expensive. You usually have less money to invest in other ways because these are so expensive. Now, to go into my actual first point, actually no, before that, a model would be to actually opt out, of course, to stop giving carbon credits to vegetation, whatever it is, and focus more on a proactive, focus on companies who are making more proactive choices, such as installing solar panels and stuff, changing what they use for energy, changing how they actually alternatively practicing what they're doing rather than just as I would get in my substantive, not actually change. So firstly, it's actually a false way to bolster the organization's carbon emission reduction. Basically, most companies. So why is the vegetation whole thing bad? Is because they're basically saying they're basically able to farm carbon credits because of the way that the model actually works for them, in the way that they can just go, hey, we had this initial plan to do like had this initial plan to graze here, or like have people cattle graze here, but you know what? Since we're such a good company, since we're such good people, we won't do it. Now give us carbon credit. Now give us carbon credits, and the government just goes, the organization goes, you're right. That means that in that way, that looks like there's less the reduction of emissions because there's no the people these cows or whatever that are not actually grazing, yada yada yada. Now, why is that actually bad? Well, it's because they basically get away with like doing nothing in the proactive in the proactive gain want into reducing emissions. What we want is to reduce emissions. It's a big factor in this debate because it's what the ACCC is supposed to like do. It's supposed to incentivize organizations to get less carbon in the air, right, and have a less of a carbon footprint. So this is bad for like two reasons. Also they're able to sell these carbon emissions, carbon point credits to other organizations and to the government. So basically, and I'll get to that a little bit more in my second point. But this is bad for like two reasons. So so it means the company. So it means that the actual companies who are doing these vegetative practices don't actually have to change it all. They don't have to change their model, or they don't have to actually provide like evidence, like more new or like proper evidence in the fact that what they're doing is like even more like carbon like emission reductive. It's basically saying, hey, we're doing this thing, just give us credits. And it's also the fact that they can, as they can farm this, it makes them more profitable without changing. So they get these carbon credits, they can sell them to the government, they can sell them to other companies, and they're basically profiting off of not changing and not actually reducing their carbon. And which actually goes into my second point, which is like there's less accountability for just in general for both the company for the companies that are doing these grazing tactics, and then the companies that they're selling to, and then as a reduction of whole, there's a reduction in overall emissions, which is a bad thing because, as I explained earlier, the fact that they can be sold to other companies. So a lot of companies, as I defined in the first in my context, they're gonna be selling to the guys who are like oil companies, like fossil fuel companies, mining companies, the ones who just really don't care about like their carbon emissions or like what they're actually like doing to the environment. So what it basically does is by these companies selling it to these bad companies, these ones who are emitting carbon, they're basically almost subsidizing what they're doing because those carbon credits can be used as can be sold to the government as tax breaks. Also makes it look like they're doing more than they actually are in the way that it basically subsidizes the bad behavior. It also makes it look because they can also show these carbon credits to like the investors, or people like shareholders. They can also use it as advertising, that kind of thing. Where it's like, hey, look at all our carbon credits that we got from this organization that's accredited. That's good, and that means we're doing good, right? We're doing great. Don't look at the other mines. Which means overall there's less accountability. And now why is less accountability bad? Hide behind the carbon credits. Basically also takes away from companies who are actively trying to change, who are actively trying to reduce the amount of carbon in the air. Because if all these carbon credits are going into these companies, these like vegetation companies who are easily farming them, as the model says, what it says. Then that means that they can sell them to companies who can afford them. So, and usually we're characterizing companies who don't care about that bottom line as much, like fossil fuels, like mining. They have a lot more money to spend on like advertising, and especially they lobby. The amount of the money they spend on lobbying by itself is like insane. And because of that, they can buy more of these carbon credits from these from these organizations, and thus like outweigh the number of carbon credits that like a normal renewable energy company like tries to like can get, and they can buy more because a renewable energy company just doesn't have the money to buy them from these the extras from the vegetation state company, whatever, I don't even know what they're called. And overall, this is bad because it means there's less focus on the renewable energy companies who are actively trying to reduce emissions, and they have less fun, they have less accreditation, and then there's more focus and more bolstering of the ones who are actually increasing the carbon outtake. Thank you very much. Oh, that's.
Thank you so much first. That's next.
For all of affirmative's benefits to stand in this debate, they need to prove that the big companies which they talk about actually turn to the alternatives that they give to reduce their carbon emissions. What is so beneficial about vegetation management is that it's very easy and cheap to do, and that is the reason that a lot of companies turn to it to offset their emissions. Under affirmative, corporations don't turn to the alternatives because it just becomes too difficult. We thus limit emissions much more. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, on why we get less emissions. And thirdly, on the unique benefits of vegetation management compared to the other alternatives which are given by affirmative. Okay, so setup, just want to clarify the way that the ACCU works. So basically, the ACCU just puts a dollar price on carbon. And so if you can reduce your carbon by 1 ton, they give you a credit of say $1,000. But what is special about this is they don't care how companies achieve this. They just care that the reduction is done. They don't care about how they achieve it. So then secondly, how does vegetation management reduce emissions? 2, I guess, reasons. Firstly, it's just that they grow trees, which sucks in CO2. Obviously that's good because that reduces carbon. But secondly, it means that they buy land, which would otherwise be used for livestock. And so that means that there is not livestock on this land anymore. That is good because livestock damages the land when they're grazing. But secondly, livestock also damage the land when they fart and stuff and they put the gases in the air, which is bad for the environment. And I also note here that this is really important in Australia because a large amount of our emissions do come from horticultural stuff and cows and stuff. That's important. Okay, so then third piece of setup is what we actually think the alternative looks like. We think that in affirmative as well, we think that the alternative is actually that there are less credits given out because affirmative need to show that they are likely to use the other alternatives, which they haven't. Okay, that's setup. Now onto why we uniquely get less emissions, and this just responds to all the affirmative push about how this allows companies to get away with more emissions. First thing to say is that the status quo is that companies want carbon credits because they want to sell them. And obviously almost half of these credits right now are through these vegetation management schemes. When we stop giving credits for these, it means that people just stop doing revegetation because it's not profitable. Okay, so why don't they do the alternatives? 3 reasons. Firstly, revegetation, vegetation schemes are very easy. All it takes is buying a farm and putting some trees on it. That's so easy to do. And also there's just so much land in Australia that it is so easy to do continuously. But secondly, vegetation management stuff is very unintrusive on the production processes of a firm. For example, if you were a coal transporter, doing something like changing the way your engines work is obviously way more disruptive to the way that your firm works, whereas revegetation is so easy. You just buy a farm and put some trees on it. It's so easy, it doesn't disrupt how you are producing things. But the third reason we get less emissions is because revegetation has a very low startup cost. In that you don't need to replace all your ship's engines. It's so easy to buy, and and also it's very linear. The more you buy, you just build on it. You just keep getting more trees, and that's easy to do. I guess finally the alternatives, people don't do the alternatives because obviously revegetation is just way cheaper than all the alternatives. Obviously they want to do it cheaply. So the impact of this is that obviously yes, the incentives for firms to engage for profit exist, but when it's not, when this easy version of doing this is no longer available to them, firms just outright refuse to do it, or they just severely limit the amount that they do this. So this means that what this means in this debate is basically like X amount of carbon credits are given out for like over 50%, for over 50% of these revegetation schemes. And so like maybe a few corporations switch to solar panels, but they lose so many people under affirmative, so many people just like no longer care about this anymore. That means that there is more emissions in their world. And I also hear under less emissions, want to quickly address the stuff that we hear from First App about how like more credits are bad because like they are used to subsidize like bigger pollution. A few things to note, like credits in and of themselves are not bad because like the ACCU doesn't like care how you're reducing emissions. The credits are just given for reducing emissions, so obviously they are good. But secondly, we think that like corporations and people who get these credits don't always sell them. Oftentimes, and like likely they hold onto them as an investment. But thirdly, if they do sell, it is likely that they sell it to the government because the government also often does like buyback policies and stuff, which means that if they are selling it, it's very likely that they're selling it to the government. So more credits is not bad, and we significantly reduce emissions in our world. Affirmative needs to prove that people turn to the alternatives, which I've just proven they won't. So next thing in this speech is the like better externalities of vegetation management schemes. And this again responds to what we hear from Affirmative about vegetation management schemes not doing anything. So here I want to explain, like all the ACCU care about is the carbon offset. Like they'll price like 100 square meters of land as like equivalent to 10 solar panels. Like they don't care how you do it, it's just like that it happens and that it's equal to the other stuff. Because like both things reduce the carbon by 2 tons. It doesn't matter how you reduce the carbon by 2 tons as long as you reduce the carbon by 2 tons. So revegetation has like beneficial externalities that other alternatives don't. 4 reasons for this. Firstly, revegetation just like has carbon benefits, as I explained before, like when you're growing trees, obviously that's good. But secondly, like it just ensures like soil quality is improved in the long term. Like when you have these like nice areas of vegetation, the soil quality improves in the long term. That is really important to the environment. Thirdly, it really helps with the repopulation of ecosystems, which is very important. Fourthly, it often leads to less drought because plants like retain way more water, and that leads to less drought. So this is good for like a number of reasons. Firstly, it's really good for like farmers. Secondly, it's really good just like for everyone who like lives on the land. Obviously, this has benefits. It's also really beneficial for local regional towns because like they're less disrupted by things such as drought. That is obviously really beneficial. And finally, it's just like beneficial for animals, like koalas and stuff get to like hang out in the trees. That's really beneficial. That's really important, especially like to the environment. So let's talk about the counterfactual and like the alternatives and why those are bad. So we think that the counterfactual is like likely to be solar panels because like that's I guess like the next thing that is the next thing that is done. And so like because like changing production processes is just way too hard. So that is probably the likely counterfactual. These things have really bad externalities. That's for a few reasons. Firstly, because like solar panels are very hard to dispose of. The metals that solar panels are made of like become toxic like over time. So like when you're trying to dispose of a solar panel, it actually like harms the environment when you dispose of it because it has all these like metals that become toxic when you're disposing of it, and that's bad for the environment. But secondly, like you need a lot of land to clear for things such as solar panels to work because obviously you need like them to be getting direct sunlight and stuff. So it often involves like deforestation and stuff. Third reason why the alternatives are bad is because like they often like the production of these things often has like upstream environmental harm. For example, like solar panels, like they require the mining of rare minerals, and obviously mining is bad for the environment. This is obviously bad. So basically, what this argument means is that for every ton of carbon that is saved by the alternatives that Affirmative gives you, there are actually harms that occur to the environment in the process of these things happening, whereas comparatively, vegetation schemes don't have any harms to the environment in the process of them happening. So, what should you believe at the end of this speech? Firstly, you should believe that for Affirmative to win, they need to prove that people turn to these alternatives, which they don't. And I have proven to you that they don't turn to these alternatives because vegetation is so uniquely easy for corporations to do. This is like, they turn to this, they don't turn to alternatives. We get way less carbon emissions on our side. The second thing that this speech does is to say that vegetation is unique in that it doesn't have any harms in the production of it happening, whereas other alternatives, more like riskier alternatives, like such as solar panels, do have harms to the environment. Vote negative.
Thank you so much to A again.
I think the problem with the affirmatives case is they still have to stand by the ACCU system. They still have to stand by a system where carbon is paid for by credits, given that there's no other counter model, and their burden in the debate seems to support this system, only with the exception of not supporting the specific revegetation. So when they don't tell you why companies are likely to turn to alternatives, all you get is the same flawed system where people move around carbon credits to other companies, but none of the benefits in the fact no one's engaging in it anymore and no one's doing these good programs. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, why we get so many more credits given out on our side of the house. Secondly, why more credits given out is actually net good for carbon emissions. And lastly, on the externalities and which form of carbon offset gets better externalities. The first thing which they keep trying to claim is that this sort of revegetation actually does nothing for the environment. We mechanise out why it does, but it actually, you should just believe so because the ACCU believes so. Their whole point is to price carbon, right? They will give you 1 tonne of carbon credit if you stop 1 tonne of carbon emission. There are 4 mechs why they're good at this. Firstly, they're the government and they have information about this, how this works, they have scientists, whatever. Secondly, it would be a horrible system with no legitimacy at all if they were bad at pricing how much revegetation actually contributes to carbon offset. And thirdly, if they're so bad at judging revegetation as a form of carbon offset and don't know how to price it, wouldn't they be equally bad at judging the effectiveness of all other forms of carbon offset like solar panels and that sort of stuff? Therefore, you should believe that when a company gets 1 tonne of carbon credit for revegetation, they actually legitimately removed 1 tonne of carbon from the Australian atmosphere, whether that be the opportunity that they stopped the farmer from putting cows there and farting and releasing carbon, or from the actual fact that they plant trees which suck in carbon. So we tell you that's a huge amount of companies who just refuse to engage in the system anymore. For a number of reasons that Bibi tells you quite eloquently, which is it's really cheap, really easy, and super effective just to do this form of carbon offset. They say they'll switch to alternatives, didn't quite understand why, and secondly, if companies are as bad and malicious as you believe, then you should believe all they care about is the bottom line. So insofar in engaging in the system in their side of the house, when you have to totally revamp your production, reduce profits for years and years on end, you should believe that they're not going to do this in order to keep their bottom line up. Therefore, we get so many more people reducing carbon in the atmosphere and given credits for this reduction. Then they have another defense, which is the credits actually aren't good. They're quite bad because you trade them and sell them and someone else just does the polluting for you. Bibi tells you why they're actually not carbon neutral. That is to say, when you get these credits, oftentimes they're never actually sold to other companies, mechanism 1. You just hold them in investments for very, very long periods of time, possibly indefinitely as sort of company holdings. And secondly, the governments often buy back directly from companies. They do these large-scale buybacks, so that the carbon you saved and you got that credit, it never goes to another company who's going to pollute for you. The government say, we're going to buy them all back, obviously in an effort to keep up their price and to reduce the amount of carbon being sold. We think it'd be hard to say that the government doesn't do this. Average reasonable voter probably knows that was the premise of the system being set up when the carbon tax got dumped. That was the concession that the Liberals made. Secondly, they keep saying that we should focus on companies changing their actual practices, right? Shutting down mines, polluting less, solar panels, not quite sure. But they have to stand by the same model where credits are given to a company and then they just sell it on to another company or whoever else to do the polluting for them. So let's take their case at the very best and that none of what Bibi says stands, and that it actually is carbon neutral, right? So every time a carbon credit is given, it's not good nor bad because that person saved a ton of carbon, but the person they sell it to pollutes a ton of carbon. Even if you believe that, we still think this is a win for our side of the house. Because insofar as you're giving out way more credits, that means that the Australian economy can just pollute the atmosphere with way more CO2, but remain at the same equilibrium of total carbon output, which is tremendously good for an economy because you can do things like create cheaper energy through burning fossil fuel. You can create things like doing more production through the pollution of the environment, putting CO2 into the air. Because under both sides of the house, we're still on the same equilibrium. Because on their side of the house, there's way less people doing carbon offset, but there's less people polluting. On our side of the house, way more people doing carbon offset, way more people polluting. At the very best case, we remain the same level of carbon emission, except on our side of the house, the economy is just way more productive. Because we can remain at the same level of carbon, but nonetheless, still produce way more stuff and pollute the environment, which is really important to all sorts of productive activities. Okay, so we end of that, just believe in our best case, we save heaps of carbon, right? Because they're actually not carbon neutral when you give these credits. But in our absolute worst case, we have the same amount of total carbon output under both Australias, but under our Australia, just way more productive stuff. Now I want to talk about externalities, because I admit that a lot of that is quite marginal, right, in the instance that you believe that it actually is carbon neutral giving out these credits. Why do we win on externalities? Bibi tells you there are 3 specific good externalities which the ACCU never take into account when doing this calculus, which are really good. Firstly, long-term farming in an area. If we want to live in this land for hundreds of years to come, you probably want farmland which is arable in the future. Insofar as you're planting trees and regenerating, it sort of reinvigorates the soil by putting vitamins into it that cows and other crops would otherwise suck out. Secondly, ecosystems are far better. If you care about koalas, or in general just a functioning ecosystem, which is so important for any number of productive and just general nice activities, it's far better with regenerative farming. And 3, regional towns experience things like less drought, because when you have regenerative farming, the soil holds more water, the ecosystem operates in a better way, all the water just doesn't rush off into the lowland. Regional towns do far better in the instance that regenerative farming comes near them. Versus, we haven't exactly heard what the likely counter will be, but we're going to assume it's something like solar panels, because Bibi told you it's pretty comparable for a company that's willing to do regenerative farming. It's similar in that you can just install them, you just put the cost in, and they sit there. Unclear that why they, under their side of the house, companies would overhaul their own production process. We told you if you believe it's solar panels or anything analogous in this sort of like electric renewable space, they have a bunch of horrible externalities which the ACCU never take into account. And they were, 1, the disposal is terrible because solar panels only last for 10 years and then you have this toxic metal rotting away wherever you put it. Secondly, there's a lot of upstream harms in production, in mining the minerals to do it. All the factories in foreign lands where they use so much carbon in order to manufacture the solar panels. So therefore, in the instance that you're saving, 1 ton of carbon through regenerative farming or through solar panels or some other means, you'd rather save it through regenerative farming because there are all sorts of other good externalities that come from that. They give you a response to this externality and say there's a really horrible part of regenerative farming, which is the livestock just go to another place. So although it seems like you're saving carbon in a given instance, you're actually not, because that farmer just moves somewhere else. 3 responses to this. Firstly, there's obviously limited privately held farmland in all of Australia. It's not the American frontier. You can't just take your cattle and walk like west and just set up there. You have to buy and sell land, and there's a finite amount, right? There's not just much spare farmland sitting out in Australia, especially in Australia where there are limited zones of like farming capacity because half of it is desert and the other half is the Pacific Ocean. Secondly, we think in a lot of these instances, people aren't selling their land to a regenerative farm to buy an analogous farm and set up the same farm there, because that would just be a lot of effort to make no money, because presuming you want to have similar amount of livestock and crops, you just have to move your whole family and whole life and pay stamp duty and all this other rubbish when you could have just stayed there. Within most cases, it's farmers who are maybe willing to sell their farm for a good price and get out of the farming game. In some instances, it's property that these companies already own and they were otherwise going to sell to farmers that they don't, so on and so forth. So you should believe that there isn't this externality, that the same farms, the same solutions can move anywhere. Therefore, even if you believe the whole first issue is a wash about carbon output, we still win on the fact that we'd rather carbon offset be done through this mechanism because it has all these good externalities as opposed to solar panels or whatever else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, second negative. To finish the affirmative case, we have 3A.
Okay, 2 issues in this debate. Firstly, about how we get better results for farmers, and then secondly, about how we get better results for other companies. Okay, firstly, about farmers. The opposition wanted to start off their speech by telling you all these reasons for why this revegetation is really easy for people to do and why it was effective, right? I think that what they don't understand is, like, as a farmer, right, I would probably want my cows to be living. I probably wouldn't want them to be affected by drought to such a great extent. I'm probably a member of the local community, so I probably don't want to see our local environment being degraded. Probably care about the koalas. Like, I probably don't want there to be a drought so that then I lose all my livestock and I lose my like main source of income. I think what they don't prove under their side of their case is why it is that these farmers actually need any sort of incentive in order to get change, right? I think that what they need to prove, right, is that yeah, this is like, I think that it's also like mentioned in the info slide, right? Because I think this is like probably why the like farming, the like vegetation sector gets like the most amount of these carbon credits, is that it's like probably really easy to do because there's already exists this incentive for them to actually do good things that are actually sustainable so that their cows can like actually live and be like super healthy people. I think that what the opposition needs to do is like, I don't know, other mechanisms. I don't know, there's like lock the gate and like farming, like environmentalist organizations that like care about these sorts of things too. I don't know. I think that they need to they need to show how you actually like why you actually need to incentivize like farmers to do things in a more sustainable way in order to justify this spending, right? Because we think that if you like give people, we think that this spending will probably be much more better to be invested in other ways, so that these farmers could like do things a bit more sustainably in ways that they currently can't because there's like it's like expensive, etc. That they have like, you know, they can have like solar panels which provide sustainable energy. No, I don't really believe any sort of the opposition's mechanization that like solar panels are like bad for the environment. I think that you should weigh like the fact that they probably are quite long lasting, probably that they're like they're able to like provide energy for like houses and farms for like a significant amount of time. I think that that's probably going to be like a net benefit for the environment, a net benefit for these farms too. But also like yeah, it means that they can like continue doing their things to an environmentally safe extent. But also, I think that also like if we give these farms like the extra amount of money, it means that they can like perpetuate this kind of cycle of harm, right? So that even if like it means that they can like have more money to do things like buy more cows or like have buy more land, do all those like do everything to a greater extent, right? That these cows can like still do all the farting that they want, have as much of a bad environment impact on the environment as they want to, right? They said that they wanted to try and like mitigate this to some extent. A second being like that they can't. This means that like that it's not the case that farmers can't just like go anywhere to like different like that, you know, there isn't like an unlimited amount of like land that's available to them. Then I think that this is probably like bad onto their side because it probably meant the farmers had to like, you know, cull some of their livestock in order to like be able to feed them to a greater extent. It means that farmers get less money. That's probably like a very bad thing for them. Probably going to be not very popular. Probably going to like decrease these farmers like livelihoods. Obviously that's going to be like important. Yeah. Okay, onto my like second issue sort of about like fossil fuel companies. I think that we proved to you like quite sufficiently why it is that these vegetation places would want to be like selling these things, in that they can be like sold for a profit. It means that they can make more money off of doing something they probably already do, right? When we think that it's probably going to be easy, this is probably going to be good for them. Note that like the buying of these types of like carbon points, like carbon credits, is like easier for like other companies like coal mines and stuff, rather than like them cutting their emissions, because it means that they're like coal and gas are just like mega rich. They can just like use their money to do these sorts of things. It means that these coal and gas companies don't have to like change any of their operations. They don't have to like risk losing like workers or risk losing like their support from the general public, because they can just like buy a few of these carbon credits, be like, you know, we're like a good company. It means that, like we told you at first, it has an impact on like how investors might think about them, how shareholders might think about them, etc. I think this is very important in this debate. So I think that like I don't know, but I think that because we proved that we like actually get better results for farmers, and I think that because the opposition kind of doesn't, I think that we're hopefully able to take this debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. But affirmative, to finish the debate, we've got the negative.
Yeah, gotcha. Thanks for letting me. Sorry, man. Sorry. Hello. Oh no, I still can see them. Yeah.
We're turned off, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Alright, let's get started. Okay. Oh, is it wacky? Okay. First question I'm going to ask in this speech is who saves more emissions via carbon credits? Note, the main push is that a harm happens when you sell carbon credits to carbon credit buyers, and then when they use them, that is particularly bad. Note, this point rests on the premise that for each carbon credit that is transacted, a carbon credit spender emits more carbon than a carbon credit seller saves in the process of doing this. Firstly, I will note they never did the mechanistic work to prove that you get this in the first place. But secondly, I'll note that we did the work from the very beginning to prove the opposite. That for every single carbon credit that is transacted, you save more than the emitter sells, the carbon seller buys. And I think that I think there's a couple of reasons why. Firstly, it is easy to regulate because you only need to count the population. You only need to count tree population and ecology. There are probably ecologists out there or something population counts. I'm sure something like that exists. I remember in ICAS science or something. But second of all, there are flow-on effects of doing really good. There are flow-on effects of doing vegetation. Things like the trees making the soil quality better, which makes it easier for trees to germinate into the future, which means you also have flow-on benefits, rather by having this thing. But thirdly, even if this isn't the easiest way to save credit, I think it is comparatively the best compared to other places because you immediately sink carbon when you plant trees. If you have other mechanisms or other ways of saving it that they might point out to you, it's because there are more layers to actually receive the benefit of minimizing carbon, it's more likely that the benefit gets lost among those layers to get to the benefit in the first place. That should tell you that for each carbon credit that you transact, you save more carbon from being emitted into the atmosphere than the carbon that are emitted. That means, at our best case, that is fantastic because it means that for every single carbon credit you use, you save the environment. Therefore, if it is true, according to the info side, that 50% of carbon credits are sold to these vegetation companies, it is devastating that 50% of those are lost because we prove to you that you lose that in the first place. But secondly, worst case, say that carbon credits do not on net save more carbons than they emit. That we're going to win there anyways, which means as we move into the second issue in this debate, which is to ask, are these revegetation projects kind of good? I think that the bar for side negative is particularly high. And the first question I'm going to ask under this is, do these vegetation farms exist anymore under their world? I would note that we gave you on our side from the very start at Bibi, they have one sole purpose for existing, which is to gain carbon credit points in the first place. Therefore, if you don't sell carbon credit points anymore, they lose the only reason as to why you begin these vegetation practices in the first place, and they don't exist anymore. Now, on a matter of framing, I think you should consider this contribution quite highly in this debate, because even if under their world, it is slightly more expensive for companies to emit carbon anymore because they can't purchase carbon credits. For instance, it costs $2 million more. We think that the harm is symmetric because they will still continue to emit carbon despite it being more pricey. And I think there are two reasons for that. Because firstly, even if the activation energy to access this benefit increases, i.e. it costs another $2 million, you still receive the benefit of having hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, which offsets that anyways. So even though it costs a little bit more to access that benefit, because you want to access that benefit anyways, you still do it. But secondly, it's just that there is the sunk cost. They've been so steep in these industries. They've put so many resources. They've built so many infrastructure. It's quite hard to turn all of your assets into liquidity and remove into another industry. It probably means that your shareholders lose trust in your company and you lose their vision. That means that these companies, at our worst case, do not budge. Which means, critically, the question in this debate is now not how many carbon credits do these companies now use, because the amount of carbon emissions that they do in both worlds are similar. Maybe it's slightly more expensive under our world. The question is, do we now have vegetation management projects anymore? And once you ask that question, that is where we unlock a lot of the benefits in our debate. Because we prove to you that these places are really, really good. We prove to you from the very start at Bibi, you get so many benefits from these particular places. What do they say in response? Firstly, they say, it takes a long time to grow. Couple of responses. Firstly, I'll question the premise of this argument, because maybe it takes a long time to access the benefit, but you access the benefit at some point in the future anyways. But secondly, I would posit that the alternatives just take as long, if not longer, the alternatives that they pointed to you that you could do instead. Because when you buy infrastructure and when you ship it in, one is unprecedented, so it's unlikely you have the supply lines pre-existing to make that happen anymore. But two, it's just generally quite a large thing. You require things like planning a farm, so on, so forth. Now, they counter push at third by saying, the livelihood that I'm going to say that for the other clash. Which means that at the end of, and then they said this livestock goes to another place, so you still accrue that harm anyways. Firstly, I would ask, where do they go? Because there are no places for it to go, because a lot of the farmland, a lot of the places where you can grow arable land is taken in Australia. But secondly, it doesn't stop these people because you have vegetation management practices and they want to save carbon credit that way. Even if you believe it is like 500 hectares of land that is used for vegetation practices, that is comparatively better than their world where that land is being used for farming. Now, as we move on to the third question and ask, what are the alternatives? I want to note that even if you didn't believe the first clash when we proved to you why we save more carbon credits per credit transacted, therefore it's good to have more carbon credits, and even if you did not believe that these vegetation farms were good, that means as we move into the third issue and ask whether or not the alternatives are worse, the bar for side affirmative is sufficiently high because they must overcome those wins that we have in the first 2/3 of this debate. And I think it is in fact here where they need to win the most, where they need to win the biggest, that we take our biggest wins. Firstly, I would note that in terms of the alternatives, what does Bibi tell you? First of all, you have solar farms. Second of all, you have vegetation projects. What do they say in response? Firstly, they say that emitters buy land from these farmers and they emit on this instead. Firstly, why would they? Like, if you're a fossil fuel company, what are you going to do with farmland in Orange? You need stuff under the ground to be able to do that. But secondly, the fact that because they have more spending power than meager farmers, the fact that they haven't done this already shows a revealed preference to not buying this land because if evaluated, it is not worth that purchase anyways. Then, now, their best push is at third, and it is that, farmers plant trees because they understand it is good for their people. Firstly, I would posit these farmers oftentimes don't care enough to make that huge transaction because it is often easier to buy hay than it is to revegetate the entirety of the land. And maybe you have some ethical farmers, but clearly we weigh over that with the farmers that don't really care as much. But secondly, I would say, if you believe that trees are good and that farmers plant them, I think it is better where instead of having 50% of your land be cows and 50% of your land be trees, 100% of your land be trees, which is a comparative that we have under our world. So at the end of the debate, what did you know? 1, each carbon credit transacted is good, they lose 50% of that. 2, we clearly prove that the alternatives, we prove vegetation is good. 3, the alternatives are worse. Very proud to negate.
Thank you so much for the debate, everyone. I really enjoyed it. We're going to deliberate now for probably about 15 minutes, and I'll let you know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Firstly, good job on a good debate. I think this is definitely a tricky and confusing topic. I had to read the info slide multiple times during prep to make sure that if you guys are doing it, I was on top of it. So good job. I thought that this was a very interesting debate and you guys hit on, all of the key issues. In terms of general feedback, I have 2 things. The first is that I think in this debate, teams sometimes struggled to be responsive or to be generously responsive, which is just to say that I think there were kind of points made by either side that weren't really responded to by the other team or weren't really responded to, I guess, the best iteration of them, which I think at times made it hard to judge. And I'll flag in the OA where I think, it would have been pretty easy for a team to give a good response or to, I guess, tailor a response I'd given to something else and explain why it was, a response to that point as well. So I guess make sure you're listening really carefully. And even if something isn't framed as a point or even if it comes out in rebuttal or even set up or whatever, there can be substantive contributions everywhere, and try and listen out for those and make sure you're kind of capturing and responding to those as best you can at some point throughout your case. The second bit of general feedback is that I think there were in this debate quite a few contradictions at times, just in terms of the way teams were characterizing various groups. Again, this will become clear when I give examples throughout the OA, but I think teams would often claim that in one context, maybe farmers acted in this way, but in another context, they acted in this way. And again, these competing characterizations obviously, can be unstrategic, and it's better to try and have a clear think in prep and in the debate about which you think is the most plausible and stick to that, because also when you have competing characterizations, it's just confusing because I'm like, wait, is this the same point? Is this a different point? Is this a different group? Whatever. But also, again, it undercuts your point. So that's kind of for general feedback. I have specific feedback. And again, neither of those are too, I guess, clear by themselves, but hopefully when I explain the decision, they will become more clear. In terms of the decision, again, good job. We were in consensus from the beginning and we thought that it was a relatively clear debate, but still somewhat close. And we ended up giving it to the negative team. So congratulations. In terms of why that is, I'm firstly going to talk about carbon and who just gets less carbon in the atmosphere, and then about other externalities, both environmental and economic, that were mentioned at times in the debate. On carbon, here I think the best claim made by affirmative is that this is used by fossil fuel companies or other pernicious companies as a way to essentially greenwash them doing bad things, to appeal to their shareholders, to their, consumers, I guess, and basically to make it seem as if they're not bad, which allows people to kind of buy in and for them to keep doing really detrimental practices. Why don't I think this was enough to kind of win them the debate? The first thing is I think Nick points out that this is an offset, which means that for this to be effective, they still have to be, buying as much carbon as they're producing. And at that level, I don't think AF explains to me why, carbon isn't carbon, why it's harmful for IKEA to make the, cupboard if they buy the same amount of cupboard carbon up from elsewhere, if that still means the carbon in the atmosphere is remaining net neutral. So I'm not actually entirely sure what the harm is. Yes, maybe we are doing more mining than we would be otherwise, but is that bad if it's not leading to increased carbon in the atmosphere? The second reason, though, I think this doesn't quite stand up is I just think it needed a bit more analysis as to why this would cause a significant change. Again, I don't think this is targeted too well by negative, but I think that there is a big burden to prove that this would massively change the actions of fossil fuel companies. Negative does point out that it is hard for companies to change, their fundamental practices and things key to their business model. And I think that more explanation of the political pressures to change and of, how they would move away from these things in the alternative, or what the counterfactual was, would have made it kind of clear on affirmative how this transition could happen. Whereas I feel like in the debate it was kind of just said, oh, they can't greenwash, but then the consequence of that wasn't quite as clear to me, or how big of a difference that is, or what that would lead to. So again, I think it made it hard to credit this point kind of fully. Cool. Finally though, I think that to the extent affirmative argues there will still be some carbon credits, and I think negative agrees, like currently 50% of the carbon credits are non-revegetation, and those would probably still exist either way. I think that still these big corporations can probably just buy those ones instead, and so can still have the same effect because of some of the framing that affirmative gives about how these companies are the biggest, how these aren't available to smaller companies, means that to the extent you decrease the pool of carbon credits, I think the companies you impact are the smaller companies who now can't buy carbon credits, rather than the bigger ones at the top who are able to continue buying them because they're relatively rich. So it's again somewhat unclear to me why these companies can't source carbon credits in other ways if they're kind of the big Goliaths that are characterized as affirmative. So I think this point had a lot of potential, but fell down at some kind of key burdens to actually prove a particularly big impact in the debate. The second claim I think kind of made substantively by affirmative is that they say they will get more other alternative forms of carbon credit invested in, things like solar panels, mostly alternative energy, I feel like is the thing that's kind of talked about as the alternative form of investment that would happen. Basically here I think neg is pretty compelling on why this is likely to at least be less investment than would happen otherwise, because of the reasons they give about why investing in revegetation is particularly easy. I'll talk about those in a second. But additionally, I would just flag, this to me seems somewhat tense with the claim in the first point, which is that carbon credits are bad because they allow companies to hide. I think affirmative needed to explain more than why it was that solar panels were more, I guess, effective or better than, trees, given that they both presumably have the same result of, I guess, decreasing carbon overall, but the mining is still happening under either world. And so if mining is the harm that affirmative takes issue with, that seems unchanged. Even though, again, I think why mining itself was a harm as opposed to carbon levels was never quite impacted in the debate. Hopefully that makes sense. I think that's the bulk of affirmative's contributions when it comes to carbon. What does negative say? Negative says that this is a really easy way for companies to offset. They explain that it's relatively cheap, that it doesn't require immediate changes to business practices. So lots of companies kind of just do this as a way to offset, and that it is effective offsetting because it is decreasing carbon. I think that this is well explained. They tell me that it decreases carbon because you decrease livestock who create methane or fart, I guess, and also because they increase carbon capture because you have more trees and photosynthesis and stuff. Affirmative has, I think, three kind of responses to this. The first is that they say, well, this is going to be, this isn't actually going to decrease livestock because you're just going to pick up all the cows from this area and move them elsewhere and then still just claim the carbon credit, but carbon won't go down. I think this is a really interesting point. The response we have from negative is that there's no places for these cows to go, that we've kind of used up the amount of agricultural land available to us. Honestly, I think this is a bit of an odd response because I do think it's also tense with a reason they give it first as to why this is cheap, which is that there is a lot of land in Australia that we can use for revegetation. I don't really know how to weigh that. I think, again, probably it's somewhere in the middle. There is some land available to farmers. Obviously, it's a barrier. But I think more detrimentally to this response for affirmative is, firstly, if this did happen, I don't think it would happen that frequently because affirmative themselves gives me a bunch of reasons why this is really inconvenient for farmers. So it's kind of unclear why they would go out of their way to do this. Again, maybe it does decrease the probability of drought or something a little bit, but it seems like a lot of hassle given that's affirmative's framing. But also, it is just a bit unclear to me as well whether or not this is something that is at the ACC, the body, the government would credit as a, effective form of reduction, because I guess it doesn't really seem like then they'll actually be reducing carbon levels. Maybe they're reducing them in one area, but overall the farm or whatever isn't leading to a reduction. So I'm still kind of unsure that would be penalized. Again, I don't think this is explicitly given by negative, but it leaves a question in my mind. And given that I think it's already not likely to happen in the vast majority of instances, I don't think this is effective at symmetricizing negative's point about kind of carbon offsetting. The second response that affirmative gives is farmers will revegetate anyway because there are benefits for drought and soil and stuff like this. I feel like some of the issues with the above point land here as well, which is that I think this was, again, tense with affirmative's own framing about how this was difficult for farmers. like again, even if decreasing drought is good, they say moving's a real hassle. So it's unclear that the incentive way off is there overall. But I think also it is clearer the underside negative, where farmers are being paid to do this, where they're rewarding good farmers as well, so they can maybe spend more money on it, etc. as well. So again, I think, I'm not convinced farmers will do it anyway, but I think farmers will definitely do it more under negative. So again, I think at best this mitigates the point a bit, but isn't successful at flipping it. The final response they give is that trees are relatively young and ineffective, like this takes time to grow. Again, I think that this is maybe mitigation to some extent. Like again, maybe this means negative can't claim a carbon revolution. But I think Neg points out that the body, the ACC or whoever, is going to be able to measure this relatively well. So they're going to actually measure like the amount of carbon the trees are actually taking out of the earth, out of the sky, out of the air, out of the atmosphere, maybe even. And they're going to estimate it based off that. So the fact that these forests are young and developing will be kind of taken into those kind of estimations. So it will be relatively effective. That being said, I think that these are many good creative responses, and I think with a little bit more explanation, a lot of them could have been effective in really harming negative on this issue. That being said, I do think I'm persuaded by negative that this is an easy way for companies to effectively offset emissions. That's pretty good. We have less carbon in the atmosphere. Love to see that. Let's talk briefly about externalities, although I will flag, I think that was kind of the bulk of the debate. We talked mostly about carbon. Seems like carbon credits most directly affect, what happens in the carbon sphere. And the second point was generally found more as an even if, that was lost. But let's talk about externalities. Here, negative says essentially that revegetation is good. They say it's good for like soil health, it's good for drought, it's good for ecosystems, and they say solar panels are bad because they kind of have toxic metals and you produce bad things in their creation. I think some of these claims are good. Some of them I think are a little bit more suspect. We can talk about that in individual feedback. But I do definitely think that there are kind of benefits to having more forest and ecosystems. That probably is better for the environment in other capacities. And also I do believe that solar panels do have some harms, even if they're not disposed of particularly regularly. As Af points out, when they are, that's probably bad. And their production is probably more harmful than the production of trees. So I do think kind of on external environmental costs, revegetation is better, all other things being equal. The final thing to briefly consider is I think we hear two tiny little economic arguments from each side. Side affirmative says that this is better, affirmative says that this puts burden on local farmers and is harmful to them. Again, I think this is a point that maybe had some potential, but just missed a couple of burdens and was a bit underanalyzed. It was unclear to me why these were necessarily small and local farmers, why this wasn't kind of bigger farming entities, overall who were doing this. And it was somewhat unclear to me as well then what the implications of this were. Were they economic implications? Was it that we had, less meat to eat in Australia? Like, I don't know. What this kind of meant for the debate was a little harder to place, although I did. And also the fact that this was probably opt-in by farmers, as in they were choosing to sell their land or give it up or to re-vegetate it, which means it was probably in their interest. But again, I think an interesting point that I wanted to acknowledge. And finally, negative makes their own claim to kind of economic increases, basically saying that what this does is that even if we're not having less carbon in the atmosphere, it increases our carbon ceiling so we can produce more negative things without kind of continuing to increase the carbon levels in the atmosphere. Basically what it means is we can mine more. Again, I think explaining the impacts of this a little bit more would have probably been good to, land an actual real clear benefit in the debate and to have it kind of be able to be weighed against the bigger point of carbon, mitigation and extraction from the atmosphere. But I do think that this was interesting, and it was probably true that we could mine more, given I think affirmative never quite explains why mining itself is bad, and that seems to be potentially economically good. I think this is a slight win to side negative, but again, I don't think it's particularly influential in the debate, and if affirmative had won the point on the environment, they definitely would have won in spite of this point. I hope that all makes sense. This was a good debate. There was a lot going on. Lots of points were made. Please come ask questions if you feel like I missed anything. Come get feedback if you'd like, and otherwise good luck in the silent round.